Nancy Roberts, and I'm an economics professor at Arizona State University. Today we're going to continue our discussion of trade using supply and demand analysis, and this time I want to look at it from the domestic economy's perspective, when the domestic economy is the exporter rather than the importer of goods. So, for example, if we have the domestic economy, and here's the domestic supply, here's the domestic demand, and if the economy is closed, P star is the price, and Q star is the quantity that is exchanged between producer and consumer in a closed economy. Now, what if the domestic economy has a comparative advantage with the rest of the world in the production of this particular good? Let's just make this wheat, because the U.S. is pretty good at wheat and agriculture. So let's just say this is wheat. And let's assume, which is true, that the U.S. has a comparative advantage with the world in the production of wheat. In other words, this price at which we produce wheat, P star, is lower than the world price. So I'm just going to say the world price is up here. I'll call it P sub W. That's the world price. And so, here, I'll mark it over here again too, P world. So what you can see is that the U.S. can produce wheat lower than the rest of the world can produce wheat. So how does this affect the domestic economy if we allow trade? Well, here's how it affects the domestic economy. Domestic producers will export wheat. And so at this price, PW, domestic producers want to supply, I'll call this QS. That's the quantity that domestic producers would like to supply. And of course, at this higher price, PW, domestic consumers don't want to buy as much. I'll call this Q sub D. That will be the demand. Now, let's look at consumer and producer surplus. Let's see how the wealth in this economy is changed if we allow exports. So, I'm just going to mark these boxes here. I'm going to call this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sometimes I do this. Let's just call this 7. Okay, so if the economy is closed, no trade, closed, then consumer surplus is 1, 2, and 3. Consumer surplus equals 1 plus 2 plus 3. And producer surplus, if the economy is closed, is 5 and 6. 5 plus 6. So here we have the closed economy. If we allow exports, what's going to happen is the U.S. is going to, this domestic economy, is going to export QS minus QD. This is going to the rest of the world. And so if we look at, this is with free trade, and exports, consumer surplus is going to equal area 1. Producer surplus is going to equal everything below the price and above the supply curve. It's going to equal 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6. So this area right here, this triangular area 4, is the net gain to the economy because the U.S. has, or the domestic economy, has exported wheat to the rest of the world. So in this case, in the case of exports from the domestic perspective, it's the domestic producer that gains. In the case of imports, it's the domestic consumer that gains. But free trade means that both happen both imports and exports. When we start restricting exports and imports, it's often called protectionism. Then what we often do is we restrict imports coming into the country. We don't restrict exports. We say to the U.S., oh, go ahead, export. But when imports come in, we put restrictions. And it's called protectionism often because what it does is it protects the domestic economy from competition. Well, as you can see, the exporting of domestic products is a net benefit to the economy, and it's this area 4 here. This area right here, 7, is nothing. It's extraneous matter that life throws at you. I mean, often you'll have data points that are thrown at you, and it's like, well, what's this? Well, it's nothing. It's unimportant. It's more white noise. And you have to filter out and figure out what's useful and what's relevant to the problem at hand. Anyway, what we're going to do in the next video about trade is we're going to look at some restrictions on free trade. And I'm going to look at 2 different ways we restrict free trade. One is with tariffs, which is a tax. And the second way is with quotas, which is a limit on the number that can be imported into the economy. So, come back.